May 8, 2002, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. A prototype howitzer sits under camouflage netting, 4,000 rounds already fired downrange, every test passed. In Washington, a decision is being finalized that will end its existence before a single unit reaches a soldier's hands. The system was called Crusader. It could fire 10 rounds a minute, faster than any artillery piece the United States had ever built. It could drop 8 shells on a single target so precisely timed that all 8 landed within the same second. Soldiers who saw it fire called it something close to magic. It took one afternoon to kill it. Not a failed test, not a design flaw, not a single soldier who died because of it. The United States Army had spent 8 years and roughly $2 billion building the most advanced self-propelled howitzer on Earth, and the Secretary of Defense canceled it anyway, over the loudest lobbying campaign the Army had mounted in a generation. The official reason was weight, 40 tons, too heavy for the war the Pentagon believed was coming. 10 months later, American tanks crossed into Iraq and needed exactly the kind of sustained heavy artillery support that Crusader was built to provide. This is the story of a weapon that was killed not for what it failed to do, but for what kind of war it was built to fight. For 40 years, artillery doctrine in the United States Army rested on one unshaken assumption: mass wins wars. Not precision, not speed, mass. The standard American self-propelled howitzer of the late 20th century was the M109, a boxy, thin-skinned vehicle that had entered service in 1963 and been patched, upgraded, and reissued under new names ever since. By the 1990s, the version in service was called the M109 Paladin. It could fire perhaps 4 rounds a minute, and that was under ideal conditions, with a well-drilled crew and no mechanical trouble. Loading each shell meant a soldier physically lifting a 95-pound projectile by hand, seating it, ramming the charge behind it, and repeating the process, again and again under fire, in heat, in mud, in the dark. The vehicle's armor was thin enough that a rifle round from certain angles could penetrate it. Its turret offered almost no protection from counter-battery fire, the artillery duels in which enemy guns locate a firing position and return fire before the first battery can relocate. Crews trained constantly on one grim calculation: how many rounds could be fired and how fast could the gun move before the enemy's own artillery found the coordinates and answered back. This was not considered a flaw. It was considered physics. Heavy guns were slow to load because shells were heavy, and machines that handled them automatically did not yet exist in a form durable enough for a battlefield. Crews were exposed because armor added weight, and weight reduced mobility, and every artillery designer on Earth understood that trade-off as a law as fixed as gravity. Then came the Gulf War. In February 1991, American artillery units advancing into Iraq encountered something uncomfortable. Iraqi guns, many of them Soviet or Chinese in origin, could outrange and outfire the Paladin in raw rate of fire, even though American crews were better trained and American shells were more accurate. The war was won in 100 hours, and American technology proved superior in nearly every other category: air power, precision munitions, night vision. But in the specific, narrow contest of guns against guns, the U.S. Army had been reminded that mass still mattered, and that its own artillery had not kept pace with the rest of its arsenal. The lesson landed hard inside the Pentagon. Planners who had spent a decade preparing for a different kind of war, a slow, grinding NATO versus Warsaw Pact clash across the plains of Central Europe, now had fresh evidence, drawn from an actual desert battlefield, that American cannons were falling behind. The Soviet Union no longer existed, but the doctrine it had shaped, mass, rate of fire, the sheer tonnage of steel a battery could put into the air within a minute, still defined what a good howitzer was supposed to be. Every artillery officer, every procurement official, every engineer working self-propelled gun programs in 1991 accepted the same premise without argument. The next American howitzer would need to fire faster, survive counter-battery fire better, and move quicker than the Paladin ever could. Nobody in the room was asking whether the Army's next war would look like the last one. They were only asking how to win the war they already understood. That question would produce, within a decade, the single most advanced artillery system ever built by the United States, and the fastest weapons cancellation in the history of American ground combat procurement. The program that would become Crusader did not begin in 1994, and it did not begin as a reaction to Desert Storm. Its roots reached back further, into a slower, quieter recognition inside Army planning offices that had been building since the late 1980s. The M109 platform, however many times it was rebuilt, had reached the limit of what its 1963 chassis could support. The Army's own studies through the 1980s had already flagged the problem. The M109's hull was too small to accommodate true automation. Its turret ring could not be enlarged without a full redesign. Every incremental upgrade, the A2, the A3, the A4, eventually the A6 Paladin, brought a little more accuracy, a little more digital fire control sophistication, but none of it touched the fundamental bottleneck. A human being still had to lift every shell by hand. No amount of computerized targeting could make a soldier load faster than his own back and arms allowed. By 1990, before a single American tank crossed into Kuwait, the Army had already launched a research effort called the Advanced Field Artillery System, AFAS, built around a radical premise. What if the loading process itself was removed from human hands entirely? What if a howitzer could select a shell, seat it, ram it, and fire it, using robotics rather than muscle, at a rate no crew could match no matter how well trained? The early AFAS concepts were ambitious to the point of impracticality. Initial designs called for a liquid propellant system instead of traditional solid powder charges, a technology that promised even higher rates of fire and simpler logistics, since liquid propellant could theoretically be pumped rather than manually loaded charge by charge. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was a problem nobody had fully solved. Liquid propellant howitzers required precise chemical stability under battlefield conditions, temperature swings, rough handling, the vibration of a vehicle crossing open terrain that repeatedly caused testing setbacks throughout the early 1990s. Then Desert Storm arrived and changed the political weather around the program entirely. What had been a slow-moving research effort suddenly had a battlefield case study attached to it. Army officers returning from Iraq could point to specific engagements where Iraqi artillery, often older and technically inferior, had still managed to outfire American guns in the opening seconds of counter-battery exchanges, the critical window in which a battery either survives or gets located and destroyed. The story was not simply that Iraqi weapons were dangerous. It was that the world's most sophisticated ground force had encountered a rate-of-fire deficit its planners had not adequately budgeted for. The Army needed a name and a program of record, not just a research study. In the early 1990s, the AFAS effort was formally rebranded and consolidated into what would become the XM2001 Crusader, a name chosen, deliberately or not, to evoke a weapon of overwhelming and righteous force. The specifications set in this period were staggering by any historical standard. The new howitzer would need to sustain 10 to 12 rounds a minute, nearly 3 times the Paladin's best rate, using a fully automated loading system. It would need to be capable of a technique called multiple rounds, simultaneous impact, or MRSI, firing several shells at different trajectories and velocities from a single stationary position, timed so precisely that all of them struck the same target within the same fraction of a second, creating the effect of several guns firing at once from just one vehicle. It would carry only a 3-man crew, down from the Paladin's 4, because automation was meant to replace the 4th soldier entirely, and it would need armor thick enough to survive counter-battery fire that the Paladin could not. By 1993, the liquid propellant concept, the technology that had defined AFAS from the start, was quietly abandoned. It had never been reliably proven safe or consistent enough for fielding, and continuing to chase it was delaying a program the Army now considered urgent. The switch back to conventional solid propellant charges was a retreat from the most futuristic part of the original vision, but it was also, in hindsight, the decision that made the rest of the program buildable at all. What remained was still, by any measure, one of the most ambitious artillery designs ever attempted. The Army now needed a contractor capable of building it. In January 1994, it found one. In January 1994, the U.S. Army awarded the prime development contract for the XM2001 Crusader to United Defense, LP, a company that itself was a product of Cold War consolidation, formed a few years earlier from the merger of FMC Corporation's Defense Division and Harsco's BMI Combat Systems Unit. United Defense already had deep institutional experience building armored vehicles for the Army, including the Bradley fighting vehicle. But Crusader was different in kind, not just in scale. It was not an upgrade of an existing platform. It was a ground-up attempt to automate an entire category of warfare that had never been automated before. General Dynamics joined as the program's major subcontractor, bringing additional armor and systems integration expertise. Together, the two companies inherited a design brief that read less like a procurement document and more like a dare. Build a vehicle that could load, aim, and fire itself faster than any human crew in history, survive direct counter-battery fire, and do it all inside a weight envelope the Army had not yet finalized. That last detail mattered more than it seemed to at the time. The original AFAS concept, before the contract was even signed, had envisioned a vehicle in the range of 61 tons, a machine built for raw survivability and firepower with little regard for how it would actually get to a battlefield overseas. 61 tons was heavier than an M1 Abrams tank. It was a weight class that made sense only if the vehicle was expected to fight in place, in a theater where it had already been pre-positioned. The way American armor had sat in West Germany for 4 decades, waiting for a Soviet invasion that never came. United Defense's engineers, working through the mid-1990s, understood that this assumption no longer matched the world the Army was actually preparing for. The Cold War's static, forward-deployed defense of Europe was over. Whatever the next American war looked like, it was increasingly likely to begin with airlift, with the unit's equipment loaded onto cargo aircraft and flown to wherever the crisis was, not driven across a fixed, familiar frontier. A 61-ton howitzer could not be airlifted by any aircraft in the American inventory except in pieces, disassembled and reassembled on the far end, a process that could cost days a modern crisis might not allow. So the requirement changed. Sometime in the mid-1990s, the Army directed United Defense to bring the design down from 61 tons to a curb weight closer to 40, a reduction of roughly a third, achieved by trimming armor, revising the chassis, and re-engineering the automated loading system to occupy less structural mass. It was, at the time, treated as a routine engineering adjustment, the kind of weight reduction pass every major vehicle program goes through as a design matures. Nobody involved in that decision could have known in 1996 that a full decade later, this exact number, 40 tons, would become the figure a Secretary of Defense stood behind a podium and used to end the program entirely. At the moment the requirement was written, 40 tons was considered a triumph of restraint. It was the Army solving its own weight problem before anyone outside the program had even raised it as an objection. What the engineers at United Defense could not solve, no matter how much steel they trimmed, was the second half of the equation. Even at 40 tons, Crusader still needed a companion vehicle just to keep it fed with ammunition, and that companion vehicle would need to be armored, tracked, and nearly as heavy as the gun itself. The system, taken as a whole, howitzer and resupply vehicle together, was never going to be light. It was only ever going to be lighter than it used to be. That distinction would matter enormously. Later, to people in Washington who were no longer thinking in terms of engineering trade-offs at all, by early 2000, the first Crusader prototype rolled off the assembly line and into testing at Yuma Proving Ground, Arizona. A stretch of desert the U.S. military has used for decades to push new weapons past the point of failure before soldiers ever touch them. What arrived at Yuma looked from the outside like a conventional armored vehicle, tracked, low-slung, roughly the silhouette of a tank with its turret swapped for a long artillery barrel. What made it revolutionary was almost entirely invisible from the outside, buried inside the hull and turret in a system nobody had successfully built into a Western artillery piece before. Automated ammunition handling, a mechanical system that lifted, seated, and rammed each 95-pound shell without a human hand ever touching it. On the M109 Paladin, a soldier hauled every round from a storage rack, positioned it in the breech, and rammed it home by muscle, over and over, until his arms gave out or the enemy found his position first. On Crusader, that entire sequence happened inside a sealed, mechanized loading system, drawing shells from an onboard magazine of 48 rounds and feeding them into the breech automatically. A crew of 3, commander, driver, gunner, could sustain a rate of fire that would have exhausted a 4-man Paladin crew within minutes. The number that mattered most was 10 to 12 rounds a minute. Sustained. Not a burst rate that collapsed after the first 30 seconds, the way older systems did once crew fatigue set in, but a rate the automated loader could hold as long as ammunition kept coming. That was nearly 3 times what the Paladin could manage under ideal conditions, and the Paladin rarely operated under ideal conditions. Then there was the capability that made artillery officers who watched the early demonstrations stop and ask to see it again. Multiple rounds simultaneous impact, MRSI, pronounced by crews as mercy. The physics behind it were straightforward, even if the engineering was not. A shell fired at a steep, lobbing trajectory takes longer to reach its target than a shell fired flatter and faster. By varying the elevation and propellant charge of each shot, a single gun firing from a single position could send several rounds downrange on different arcs, timed so that every shell, despite leaving the barrel seconds apart, arrived at the target within the same instant. Crusader's fire control computer could calculate and execute up to 8 of these simultaneous impact shots from one stationary position. To an observer on the receiving end, 8 shells landing within the same second looked and felt exactly like 8 separate guns firing at once. It was a single vehicle manufacturing the effect of an entire battery, and it meant a Crusader crew never needed to reveal more than one firing position to deliver a battery's worth of shock. None of this happened without a second machine working in constant partnership. Crusader could not carry more than 48 rounds on its own, and a howitzer that runs dry mid-engagement is a liability, not a weapon. United Defense built a companion vehicle for exactly this problem. The resupply vehicle, or RSV, built on the same chassis and designed to transfer a full reload of 48 rounds to the howitzer in under 10 minutes, again automatically, with minimal soldier exposure outside the armor. The two vehicles were engineered to operate as a pair, communicating and coordinating so that a Crusader battery could, in theory, sustain rates of fire indefinitely as long as resupply vehicles kept the pipeline moving. The armor was thicker than the Paladin's by a wide margin, designed specifically to survive the counter-battery fire that had exposed American gun crews during Desert Storm, and the entire vehicle, cooled by a liquid system built into the barrel and loading mechanism, could operate in sustained fire conditions that would have overheated older gun designs within minutes. Through 2001 and into early 2002, the prototype at Yuma kept firing. By some counts, the single test vehicle had put more than 4,000 rounds downrange by the time testing wound down, an extraordinary figure for a system still officially in the development phase, and a number the program's supporters would later point to as evidence the technology was not experimental in any meaningful sense anymore. It worked, reliably, repeatedly, under desert conditions designed to break it. For Army officers who had spent a decade watching the Paladin's limitations up close, watching Crusader fire was close to watching a fantasy weapon made real. It solved the loading problem. It solved the rate of fire gap Desert Storm had exposed. It solved the survivability problem that had haunted gun crews since the 1960s. Every technical requirement the Army had written into the program in the early 1990s, Crusader had now demonstrably met. What it had not solved, what no amount of engineering could solve, was a question nobody serving at Yuma Proving Ground in 2001 had the authority to answer: whether the war the Army had spent a decade designing this weapon to fight was still the war anyone in Washington believed was coming. By the early 2000s, Crusader was no longer a research curiosity buried inside an Army budget line. It had become, in Pentagon terms, a program of record, funded, staffed, tracked by Congress, and increasingly central to how the Army argued for its own future relevance. The numbers behind it were substantial by any standard. Program cost estimates through its development life ran to roughly $11 billion across the full acquisition cycle, research, development, and a planned production. Run the Army hoped would eventually field more than 800 vehicles across its artillery battalions. That figure alone made Crusader one of the larger conventional weapons programs in the Army's portfolio at the turn of the century, competing for funding attention against the Army's other modernization priorities and against a defense budget still adjusting to a post-Cold War, pre-war on terror world that had not yet decided what it needed most. Fielding plans called for Crusader to begin replacing the Paladin fleet starting around 2008, a 15-year gap between the original AFAS concept studies and a soldier actually operating the finished system. A timeline that was, by the standards of major weapons programs, not unusually long, but long enough that the strategic assumptions underpinning the program's original requirements had time to shift underneath it without anyone officially updating the blueprint. Political support for the program ran deep, and not only for reasons of pure military necessity. United Defense's development and manufacturing work touched suppliers and subcontractors spread across multiple states, a familiar and durable feature of major American defense programs, where a weapon's geographic footprint becomes almost as important to its survival in Washington as its battlefield performance. Members of Congress representing districts with Crusader-related jobs had a direct constituent interest in the program's continuation, and Army leadership, aware of this dynamic, cultivated it deliberately. By 2001 and into 2002, Crusader had accumulated one of the most organized congressional support networks of any active Army procurement effort. Letters, hearing testimony, and direct lobbying aimed at protecting the program's funding line year over year. International interest followed the domestic momentum. Allied militaries watching the Crusader program, particularly within NATO, took note of a self-propelled howitzer that could outfire and outsurvive anything currently in Western inventories, and preliminary conversations about foreign interest circulated within defense industry channels, though no Allied nation committed to a purchase before the program's fate was decided in Washington. For United Defense, Crusader represented not just a single Army contract, but a potential flagship product, proof that American industry could still deliver a category-defining conventional weapons platform, at a moment when much of the Pentagon's innovation attention was already drifting toward precision munitions, unmanned systems, and digital battlefield networks rather than traditional armored firepower. Inside the Army itself, Crusader had become something close to a symbol. General Eric Shinseki, who became Army Chief of Staff in 1999, was simultaneously pushing a broader modernization vision for the service, one built around lighter, more rapidly deployable brigades that could reach a crisis zone faster than the heavy, Cold War-postured divisions the Army had maintained for decades. On paper, this push toward speed and deployability sat in obvious tension with a 40-ton howitzer and its nearly as heavy resupply vehicle. In practice, Army leadership through this period continued to defend Crusader publicly as compatible with the transformation vision, arguing that its automation and reduced crew requirements represented exactly the kind of technological leap the future force needed. Even as the raw tonnage argument grew harder to make with each passing year of Shinseki's lighter force rhetoric, that tension was the first real crack, though almost nobody treated it as one at the time. Crusader supporters were making a technological argument. This is a smarter, more automated, more survivable weapon than anything that came before it. Its skeptics, increasingly vocal inside the office of the Secretary of Defense rather than inside the Army itself, were beginning to make a different argument entirely. Not about whether the weapon worked, but about whether the entire category of heavy, ground-based artillery still belonged in the force the Pentagon wanted to build for the next war. For the moment, in 2001, that skepticism remained a minority position, confined mostly to planning documents and internal reviews rather than public statements. Crusader had survived a decade of development, changed its propellant system, cut its own weight by a third, met every performance benchmark the Army had set for it, and built one of the most durable congressional coalitions of any weapons program in recent memory. By every conventional measure the Pentagon used to judge whether a program was succeeding, Crusader was succeeding. It had, in fact, become almost too successful to kill quietly, which was precisely the reason its eventual cancellation would require something far louder than a quiet reduction in next year's budget request. The number that had once been treated as an engineering victory began, sometime around 2000 and 2001, to be treated as a liability instead. 40 tons. It was the figure United Defense's engineers had fought hard to reach, cutting Crusader down from an original 61-ton concept through years of redesign. Inside the program, it had been a triumph of restraint. Outside the program, in offices that had never run a weight reduction study on the vehicle themselves, it was becoming something else: evidence. The problem was never really the howitzer alone. 40 tons, while heavy, sat within the range of vehicles the Army already moved by ship, rail, and, with enough time and the right aircraft, by air. The real complication was that Crusader could not function as a single vehicle. It needed its companion, the resupply vehicle, operating alongside it, and the tracked version of that companion weighed in at roughly 36 tons of its own. Two vehicles, both armored, both required for the system to work as designed, both needing airlift capacity if the Army wanted to deploy Crusader batteries anywhere on short notice rather than pre-positioning them the way NATO forces had pre-positioned armor in Europe throughout the Cold War. That was the detail that mattered to a very specific and increasingly influential group of critics, the movement inside the Pentagon, and particularly inside the Air Force's own airlift planning community that had spent the 1990s pushing the C-17 Globemaster as the future backbone of American power projection. A C-17 could carry an M1 Abrams tank, but only one, and only with careful loading. A Crusader howitzer at 40 tons exceeded what a single C-17 sortie could move without disassembly in many configurations under discussion, and the resupply vehicle needed its own separate lift capacity on top of that. Getting a single Crusader battery, guns and resupply vehicles together into a crisis zone by air was beginning to look, on paper, less like rapid deployment and more like a small invasion's worth of airlift sorties consumed before a single combat unit's own equipment had even started moving. By 2001, this argument had a name and a champion inside the office of the Secretary of Defense. The vision of a lighter, more strategically mobile army, one that could put a combat-capable brigade anywhere on Earth within 96 hours. A target figure that had begun circulating in Pentagon planning documents and would soon become closely associated with the Army's own stated transformation goals under General Shinseki, even as it was increasingly weaponized by voices outside the Army to argue against the very equipment the Army still wanted to buy. Crusader, whatever its technical brilliance, was not that Army's weapon. It was the previous Army's answer to the previous Army's problem, a heavy, sustained-fire howitzer built to support armored divisions in a large-scale conventional war, at exactly the moment defense planners were increasingly preoccupied with smaller, faster, more geographically dispersed contingencies. The September 11th attacks, just months away, had not yet reframed the entire conversation around counterterrorism and expeditionary warfare, but the intellectual groundwork for that reframing, the argument that heavy armor and heavy artillery were relics of a war that would not come again, was already being laid inside the Pentagon before a single attack occurred. Inside United Defense and inside the Army's own program office, the response to the weight criticism was consistent and, on its own technical terms, reasonable. 40 tons was already a massive reduction from the original design. Cutting further would mean sacrificing the armor and automation that made Crusader survivable and effective in the first place, and no self-propelled howitzer capable of sustained heavy fire was ever going to be genuinely lightweight. That was not a flaw unique to Crusader, it was a fact about artillery itself. Every serious self-propelled gun in the world, American or otherwise, carried a similar weight burden for similar reasons. That argument had worked for a decade. It had carried Crusader through budget review after budget review, through changes in Army leadership, through a full redesign of its propulsion and loading systems. What nobody inside the program fully appreciated, heading into 2001, was that the argument was about to be tested not against a budget analyst or a congressional staffer, but against a new Secretary of Defense who had built his entire public identity around the idea that the American military's greatest obstacle to winning future wars was its own attachment to expensive legacy systems built for a war that no longer existed. Donald Rumsfeld was sworn in as Secretary of Defense on January 20, 2001, for the second time in his career. He had previously held the office under President Gerald Ford in the 1970s, making him, at 68, both the youngest and the oldest man to ever hold the position. He arrived at the Pentagon in 2001 with a mandate from President George W. Bush to modernize an institution Rumsfeld himself believed had grown bloated, risk-averse, and addicted to expensive legacy weapon systems that reflected the strategic assumptions of a war that had already ended a decade earlier. Rumsfeld called his agenda transformation, and the word was not casual branding. It represented a genuine, deeply held theory about how future wars would be fought, a conviction that speed, precision, Information dominance and networked technology would matter more than mass, armor, and raw firepower. Smaller, faster forces moved quickly by air, supported by precision-guided munitions and real-time battlefield data, would outmatch larger and heavier ones that could not get to the fight in time or maneuver once they arrived. It was, in essence, an argument that the character of war itself had changed, and that the Pentagon's procurement priorities had not caught up. This was not an abstract theory Rumsfeld kept to himself. Within months of taking office, he ordered a sweeping review of major weapons programs across every service, looking specifically for systems that embodied the old model of warfare he wanted to move away from. In April 2001, barely 3 months into his tenure, a review panel convened under Rumsfeld's direction examined Crusader alongside several other legacy modernization efforts and recommended it for cancellation. One official involved in that review offered a line that would later be repeated, almost word for word, in press coverage of the program's demise. Crusader, the official said, was a wonderful system for a legacy world. It was, in its way, the most precise obituary the program would ever receive, and it arrived more than a year before the formal cancellation was announced. The judgment was not that Crusader failed to work. Every test at Yuma had proven the opposite. The judgment was that it worked brilliantly at solving a problem the Pentagon's new leadership no longer believed was the problem worth solving. What followed was not a swift execution, but a prolonged and increasingly public struggle between two competing visions of what the Army was for. On one side stood the Army's own institutional leadership and its congressional allies, defending a program that had absorbed a decade of development, met its technical benchmarks, and represented, in their view, a genuine leap forward in artillery survivability and lethality that happened to also be heavy, because heavy artillery had always been heavy. On the other side stood Rumsfeld and a small circle of civilian Pentagon officials who viewed the entire debate through the lens of strategic mobility. Not whether Crusader was good artillery, but whether the next American war would give the Army time to move 40-ton vehicles into position before it was decided. Rumsfeld's own public rhetoric through 2001 sharpened around exactly this framing. He argued repeatedly that too much of the Pentagon's budget was locked into legacy systems, his own word, echoing the language of the April Review, that had been designed to fight the Soviet Union and were being kept alive less by strategic necessity than by institutional inertia and congressional politics. Crusader, weighing roughly 40 tons and requiring an almost equally heavy companion vehicle just to keep it fed with ammunition, became for Rumsfeld a nearly perfect illustration of his broader argument. Expensive, technologically impressive, and built for a scenario, massed armored warfare against a peer adversary in Europe that he believed was no longer the Pentagon's central problem. The Army did not surrender this argument easily. Officers and program officials pointed to the same case. Crusader's original 1990s designers had built the system around Desert Storm and the specific documented episodes in which American artillery had been outfired by less sophisticated Iraqi guns. That war, they argued, was not ancient history. It was the most recent large-scale ground conflict the United States had actually fought, and its lessons about rate of fire and counter-battery survivability remained directly relevant to any future conflict involving American ground forces at scale, wherever it happened to occur. Both sides were arguing from real evidence. Neither was simply wrong, but by late 2001, only months after Rumsfeld's April review had already recommended cancellation, one argument held a decisive advantage the other could not match: control over next year's budget submission and a Secretary of Defense willing to spend significant political capital to see his own doctrine prevail over the institution he had been appointed to lead. The September 11th attacks, arriving just months after that April review, did not resolve the argument. If anything, they complicated it further, proving in the eyes of some that the future of American warfare would be smaller, faster, and less about massed armored formations than ever before, while giving others, inside the Army, a fresh argument that a nation now fighting on multiple fronts could not afford to gut its conventional artillery capability in the middle of a war. By the spring of 2002, the argument had run its course inside the review process. What remained was the decision itself, and the specific afternoon on which Rumsfeld chose to make it. By the spring of 2002, Crusader supporters inside the Army had mounted what several Pentagon observers at the time called the most aggressive congressional lobbying campaign. The service had run in years. Program briefings went out to members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. Officers testified in favor of continued funding. Contractors and subcontractors, spread across multiple states, made sure their own representatives in Congress understood exactly what was at stake for local jobs and local factories. For a program facing a hostile Secretary of Defense, it was by any conventional measure a formidable defense. It was not enough. On May 3, 2002, Pete Aldridge, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, sent a memo to the Army with instructions that sounded, on their surface, procedural. Prepare a formal assessment of alternatives to the Crusader program to be completed by June 10th. It was the kind of bureaucratic request that, in an ordinary review cycle, might have taken months to produce and years to act on. 5 days later, before that assessment had even begun, the process it was supposedly meant to inform became irrelevant. On May 8, 2002, Secretary Rumsfeld announced, with the concurrence of President Bush, that he was recommending an amendment to the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2003 budget request terminating the Crusader program entirely. Not reducing its funding, not restructuring it, ending it. The speed of the reversal stunned even people who had watched the program's troubles building for a year. 5 days earlier, the Army had been told to study alternatives. Now there was nothing left to study an alternative to. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz later explained the sequence publicly, and his explanation was almost as revealing as the decision itself. The timing of the termination, he said, had been driven by the legislative calendar. Specifically, by when Congress was scheduled to take up the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2003 authorization legislation. If the Pentagon wanted to remove Crusader's funding from that bill, it needed to act before Congress finished its work on it, not after. The assessment of alternatives. Aldridge had ordered 5 days earlier was never going to have time to matter. The decision had, for practical purposes, already been made. Inside the Army, the reaction was fury, and it was not contained quietly. Press reports in the weeks that followed described considerable internal opposition within the Department of the Army to the cancellation. Opposition serious enough that it produced its own controversy. Allegations, later examined by Pentagon officials, that Army personnel had taken inappropriate steps to mobilize congressional support against the decision after it had already been handed down, potentially crossing lines that govern how military officials are permitted to engage in what amounted to a lobbying campaign against their own civilian leadership. It was an unusual and uncomfortable spectacle, a sitting Secretary of Defense effectively accusing his own service branch of insubordination by continuing to fight for a program he had already killed. Crusader's congressional allies did not fold immediately. Members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, representing the states and districts tied to United Defense's manufacturing and supply chain, pushed back through the only channel left to them: legislative language. Provisions were introduced seeking to keep the program alive, at minimum, until May 2003, buying time for a genuine review of alternatives rather than accepting a termination that had been announced before any formal alternative had even been assessed. For weeks, the outcome remained technically contested in Congress even after Rumsfeld's public announcement, a strange limbo in which a Secretary of Defense had declared a program dead while the program's supporters in the legislative branch still held, on paper, the power to overrule him. They did not overrule him. Through the summer of 2002, the congressional resistance eroded, worn down by a Pentagon leadership team unified and determined not to reverse course, and by a political environment increasingly consumed by the aftermath of September 11th and the early planning for what would become the invasion of Afghanistan. A conflict already demonstrating, in the eyes of transformation's advocates, exactly the kind of light, fast, precision-driven warfare Rumsfeld had been arguing the future would demand. By August 2002, the fight was over. United Defense and General Dynamics, the two companies that had spent 8 years and roughly $2 billion of committed program funding, building the most advanced self-propelled howitzer ever designed, received the formal termination notice, ending all further work on what had, by that point, become an $11 billion program. The prototype at Yuma Proving Ground, The vehicle that had fired more than 4,000 rounds without a fundamental failure, the vehicle that had proven every technical requirement the Army had written for it a decade earlier, was not sent to a unit. It was sent eventually to a display pad at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, positioned among the historical artillery pieces in the post's cannon park, a museum piece before it had ever been anything else. The decision had taken roughly 5 months from Aldridge's initial memo to the formal termination notice and only a single afternoon, May 8, 2002, for its outcome to become effectively certain. A program that had survived a decade of engineering setbacks, a full redesign of its propulsion system, a one-third reduction in its own weight, and every technical hurdle the Army could devise for it, could not survive a change in what the Pentagon's civilian leadership believed the next war was going to look like. What remained, for the people who had built it, was the harder question. What had 8 years and $2 billion actually purchased, if none of it was ever going to fire a shot that mattered? The termination notice that reached United Defense and General Dynamics in August 2002 closed out a program that had consumed roughly $2 billion in direct research and development funding over its 8-year development cycle, a figure separate from and far smaller than the $11 billion total. The program had been projected to cost across its full planned production run of more than 800 vehicles. That distinction mattered enormously to how the cancellation was described in public. Pentagon officials, defending the decision, emphasized that the vast majority of the program's projected cost had never actually been spent, that ending Crusader in 2002 was, in dollar terms, closing the door before the truly expensive part of the program, full-scale production, had even begun. That framing was accurate. It was also, for the people who had spent nearly a decade building the thing, close to beside the point. $2 billion had bought a working prototype, a validated design, a proven automated loading system, and more than 4,000 successful test firings, real engineering achievement, sitting inert on a display pad that would never become the 800 production vehicles it had been built to prove out. The human cost moved through United Defense's workforce in the months following the August termination. Engineering teams that had spent years refining the automated loading mechanism, the cooling systems, the fire control software behind MRSI targeting, expertise built specifically around Crusader's unique requirements, faced the reality that the program defining their recent careers no longer existed. Some of that talent transferred to other United Defense projects already underway. Some did not. Subcontractors tied specifically to Crusader components, spread across the same multi-state supply chain that had powered the program's congressional support network, absorbed the cancellation as a direct hit to contracts and, in some cases, to local employment tied to those contracts. United Defense itself did not collapse. The company had other major programs in its portfolio, including continued work on the Bradley fighting vehicle family, and it moved quickly to reposition its artillery expertise towards smaller, lighter follow-on concepts that might survive in the transformation-era Pentagon Rumsfeld was building. Within a few years, United Defense would be acquired by BAE Systems, folding its remaining defense manufacturing capacity, and whatever institutional memory of Crusader's engineering survived the cancellation, into one of the largest defense contractors in the world. The official narrative that emerged from the Pentagon in the months after the cancellation framed the decision in forward-looking, almost optimistic terms. Money that would have gone to Crusader's continued development was being redirected towards systems better suited to the Army's future needs. Lighter artillery concepts, precision-guided munitions, and the broader modernization effort that would soon be formalized as the Future Combat Systems Program. Rumsfeld and his deputies presented the termination not as an admission of failure, but as evidence of exactly the kind of disciplined, forward-looking decision-making that transformation was supposed to produce: the willingness to kill an expensive legacy program, however impressive on its own terms, in favor of something better aligned with where warfare was actually heading. Inside the Army and inside United Defense, the private accounting looked less tidy. A decade of design work, a full redesign of the propulsion and loading systems, a one-third reduction in vehicle weight achieved at real engineering cost, and a prototype that had met every technical benchmark it was ever assigned. All of it terminated not because the weapon failed a test, but because a change in civilian leadership brought a different theory of the next war, one under which even a machine that worked perfectly was, by definition, the wrong machine. Whether that redirected money would actually produce something better remained, in August 2002, an open question. The Army's transformation-era answer to that question was already taking shape on paper. It would take years and hundreds of millions more dollars before anyone found out whether it worked any better than the howitzer it was replacing. Crusader's cancellation did not end the Army's search for a next-generation self-propelled howitzer. It redirected that search into a far larger and more ambitious framework, one that would, within a few years, produce a second cautionary tale built on many of the same assumptions that had killed the first. The successor effort was called Future Combat Systems, or FCS, an enormous, sprawling modernization program launched under the same transformation philosophy Rumsfeld had used to justify Crusader's termination. Where Crusader had been a single vehicle type, FCS was a family of 18 interconnected manned and unmanned systems, tied together by a digital battlefield network that was supposed to let every vehicle share sensor data and targeting information in real time. It was, in almost every sense, the doctrinal opposite of what Crusader represented: lighter, networked, information-centric, rather than armor and firepower-centric, built explicitly around the premise that speed and situational awareness could substitute for mass and protection. Among the 18 systems planned under FCS was a replacement howitzer, designated the XM2003 Non-Line-of-Sight Cannon, or NLOS-C. At roughly 18 tons, it weighed less than half of Crusader's own reduced 40-ton design, a number that, on paper, appeared to solve exactly the mobility and airlift problem that had been used to kill its predecessor. And in a detail that rarely made it into the political coverage of Crusader's cancellation, the NLOS-C was not built from scratch. It drew directly on automation and fire control technology developed during the Crusader program. The same automated loading concepts, refined and adapted, now fitted into a dramatically lighter chassis. The engineering lineage was continuous, even though the political story insisted on a clean break. That continuity mattered, and it also revealed something uncomfortable about the entire cancellation debate: the loading automation and fire control sophistication that had made Crusader revolutionary were not, themselves, the problem Rumsfeld had objected to. The weight was the problem. And so the Army, working within Rumsfeld's own transformation framework, spent the years after 2002 trying to preserve everything Crusader had proven except the one specification its creator, the Secretary of Defense, had declared unacceptable. It did not work. The Future Combat Systems program and the NLOS-C howitzer within it ran into a familiar set of problems through the mid-2000s: cost overruns, schedule slips, and mounting skepticism about whether a battlefield network ambitious enough to connect 18 different vehicle types in real time could actually be built on the Army's timeline or budget. By 2009, under a new administration and a new Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, the entire Future Combat Systems program was substantially restructured, and in December of that year, the NLOS-C howitzer program was formally canceled, a second self-propelled artillery program built to replace the first canceled program, itself canceled 7 years later without ever reaching a single combat unit. The Army was now in a position that would have seemed almost impossible to predict, standing at Yuma Proving Ground in 2001, watching Crusader fire flawlessly downrange. 2 consecutive multi-billion-dollar attempts to replace the aging M109 Paladin had both ended in cancellation, and the Paladin itself, the same platform whose limitations had launched the entire Crusader program back in the early 1990s, remained the Army's primary self-propelled howitzer, still in service, still being incrementally upgraded, more than 2 decades after its replacement had first been deemed necessary. No formal state funeral marked Crusader's end. No renamed factory, no posthumous award softened the manner of its cancellation. What honor the program received came only indirectly, years later, embedded quietly inside the technical bones of a program that itself would fail. Automation systems Crusader had proven, riding inside a lighter howitzer that could not survive its own version of the same institutional and budgetary pressures that had killed its predecessor. The prototype at Fort Sill sat in the cannon park through all of it, a fixed point of steel, while the Army spent most of the following 2 decades searching, unsuccessfully, for something to replace it. 20 years passed. The M109 Paladin, upgraded again into the M109A7 configuration, remained the backbone of American self-propelled artillery. The same platform Crusader had been designed to replace back in the early 1990s, still carrying the weight of a mission its own designers had considered obsolete decades earlier. The Army had spent 2 full development cycles and roughly $3 billion combined across Crusader and the NLOSC attempting to field a successor. Both attempts had ended the same way, canceled before a single production unit reached a unit's motor pool. Then, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and within months, a war few Pentagon planners had spent serious time preparing for was reintroducing, in brutal and highly visible terms, exactly the lesson that had justified Crusader's creation 3 decades earlier. Artillery, it turned out, still decided battles. Ukrainian and Russian forces alike burned through artillery barrels and ammunition stockpiles at rates that stunned Western defense planners, who had spent 2 decades building expeditionary forces optimized for smaller, faster, lower-intensity conflicts against insurgents rather than sustained, high-volume gun duels against a peer military. Reports from the front described artillery pieces firing so many rounds so continuously that barrels wore out and had to be replaced. A rate of fire and volume of sustained fire that the aging Paladin fleet, the very platform Crusader had once promised to replace, was not built to sustain. The Army's response arrived not as a dramatic new program launch, but as a quieter acceleration of an effort that had already been underway for several years before the invasion. Extended Range Cannon Artillery, or ERCA, a program built not around Crusader's radical automation and reduced crew size, but around a more modest goal, extending the M109 platform's range and rate of fire without the weight penalties that had doomed its predecessor. It was, in effect, an admission delivered without ever using the word. The Army needed more artillery capability sooner and could no longer afford to wait for a revolutionary next-generation system that might once again be canceled before it reached the field. The irony sat plainly in the historical record, even if no Pentagon press release ever stated it directly. The weapon killed in 2002 for being built for a legacy world was, by 2022, precisely the kind of capability that same legacy world's return had proven necessary. Crusader had not been wrong about the mission. It had simply arrived at a moment when the institution funding it had concluded, with genuine conviction and considerable evidence of its own, that the mission no longer mattered. And it took a war in Eastern Europe 20 years later to prove how wrong that conclusion had been. Rumsfeld himself was not present to see it. He died in 2021, months before the invasion that would revive the very argument his own decision had once appeared to settle. He never publicly revisited the Crusader cancellation as anything other than a correct application of his broader transformation philosophy, a philosophy that, in fairness to him, produced real and lasting change across American military procurement, some of it genuinely overdue. The Pentagon he inherited in 2001 had, in many respects, been too slow to retire programs that no longer served a clear strategic purpose. Transformation was not, in its broad outlines, a mistaken idea. Crusader was the specific case where the idea and the evidence pointed in opposite directions, and the idea won anyway. The counterfactual is impossible to prove and easy to imagine. Had Crusader survived past 2002, entered production on its original schedule, and reached Army artillery battalions by the late 2000s, the force facing a sustained high-intensity artillery war in 2022 would have carried a very different set of tools than the one it actually had. Whether it would have made a decisive difference in a conflict fought on the other side of the world, by other nations, using other equipment entirely, is unknowable. What is knowable is narrower, and in its way, more damning. The specific capability gap that defense analysts spent 2022 and 2023 scrambling to close, sustained high-volume artillery fire from a survivable automated platform, was the exact gap Crusader had been engineered, at enormous cost and after a decade of development, to close 2 decades earlier. The prototype still sits in the cannon park at Fort Sill, among the retired guns of older wars, a fixed point of steel that never fired a shot in anger and never will. It was not defeated by an enemy weapon or an enemy army or a battlefield failure of any kind. It was defeated by a theory of the future, one that turned out, 20 years later, to have been wrong about exactly the war that mattered most. They said it was built for a war that would never come again. The war came anyway. Crusader did not.